Dear Elizabeth, some intelligence which I received yesterday obliges me unexpectedly to leave Baden. You will find me at Mayence. Request Miss Jervis to have everything packed up as speedily as possible, and to send for the landlord and give up the possession of our house. The rent is paid. Come in the carriage. I shall expect you this evening. Yours, dearest, J. Falkner. Nothing could be more disappointing than this note. Her first fairy dream beyond the limits of her home, to be thus brushed away at once. No word of young Neville, no hope held out of return. For a moment an emotion ruffled her mind, very like ill humor. She read the note again. It seemed yet more unsatisfactory, but in turning the page she found a postscript. Pardon me, it said, for not seeing you last night. I was not well, nor am I now. These few words instantly gave a new direction to her thoughts. Her father not well, and she absent, was very painful. Then she recurred to the beginning of the note. Intelligence received yesterday, some evil news, surely, since the result was to make him ill. At such a word the recollection of his sufferings rushed upon her, and she thought no more of the unhappy boy, but hurrying to Miss Jervis, entreated her to use the utmost expedition that they might depart speedily. Once she visited Neville's horse. It was doing well, and she ordered it to be led carefully and slowly to Sir Boyville's stables. So great was her impatience that by noon they were in the carriage, and in a few hours they joined Falkner at Mayence. Elizabeth gazed anxiously on him. He was an altered man. There was something wild and haggard in his looks that bespoke a sleepless night and a struggle of painful emotion by which the very elements of his being were convulsed. "You are ill, dear father," cried Elizabeth. "You have heard some news that afflicts you very much." "I have," he replied, "but do not regard me. I shall recover the shock soon, and then all will be as it was before. Do not ask questions, but we must return to England immediately." To England, such a word Falkner had never before spoken. Miss Jervis looked almost surprised and really pleased. A return to her native country, so long deserted and almost forgotten, was an event to excite Elizabeth even to agitation. The very name was full of so many associations. Were they hereafter to reside there? Should they visit Treby? What was about to happen? She was bid ask no questions, and she obeyed, but her thoughts were the more busy. She remembered also that Neville was English, and she looked forward to meeting him and renewing her projects for his welfare. Chapter 8. In the human heart, and if observation does not err, more particularly in the heart of man, the passions exert their influence fitfully. With some analogy to the laws which govern the elements, they now sleep in calm, and now arise with the violence of furious winds. Falkner had latterly attained a state of feeling approaching to equanimity. He displayed more cheerfulness, a readier interest in the daily course of events, a power to give himself up to any topic discussed in his presence, but this had now vanished. Gloom sat on his brow. He was inattentive even to Elizabeth. Sunk back in the carriage, his eyes bent on vacancy, he was the prey of thoughts, each of which had the power to wound. It was a melancholy journey, and when they arrived in London, Falkner became still more absorbed and wretched. The action of remorse, which had been for some time suspended, renewed its attacks and made him look upon himself as a creature at once hateful and accursed. We are such weak beings that the senses have power to impress us with a vividness which no mere mental operation can produce. Falkner had been at various times haunted by the probable consequences of his guilt on the child of his victim. He recollected the selfish and arrogant character of his father, and conscience had led him to reproach himself with the conviction that whatever virtues young Neville derived from his mother or had been implanted by her care must have been rooted out by the neglect or evil example of his surviving parent. The actual effect of her loss he had not anticipated. There was something heartbreaking to see a youth, nobly gifted by nature and fortune, delivered over to a sullen resentment for unmerited wrongs, to dejection, if not to despair. An uninterested observer must deeply compassionate him. Elizabeth had done so, child as she was, with a pity almost painful from its excess. What, then, must he feel who knew himself to be the cause of all his woe? Falkner was not a man to sit quietly under these emotions. In their first onset, they had driven him to suicide. Preserved as by a miracle, he had exerted strong self-command, and, by dint of resolution, forced himself to live. Year after year had passed, and he abided by the sentence of life he had passed on himself, and like the galley slave, the iron which had eaten into the flesh galled less than when newly applied. But he was brought back from the patience engendered by custom at the sight of the unfortunate boy. He felt himself accursed, God reprobated, mankind, though they knew it not, abhorred him. He would no longer live, for he deserved to die. He would not again raise his hand against himself, but there are many gates to the tomb. He found no difficulty in selecting one by which to enter. He resolved to enter upon a scene of desperate warfare in a distant country, and to seek a deliverance from the pains of life by the bullet or the sword on the field of battle. Above all, he resolved that Elizabeth's innocence should no longer be associated with his guilt. The catastrophe he meditated must be sought alone, and she, whom he had lived to protect and foster, must be guarded from the hardships and perils to which he was about to deliver himself up. Meditation on this new course absorbed him for some days. At first he had been sunk in despondency, as the prospect opened before him of activity allied to peril, and sought for the sake of the destruction to which it unavoidably led. His spirits rose, like a war-horse dreaming of the sound of a trumpet. His heart beat high in the hope of forgetting the consciousness of remorse in all the turbulence of battle or the last forgetfulness of the grave. Still, it was a difficult task to impart his plan to the orphan and to prepare her for a separation. Several times he had tried to commence the subject and felt his courage fail him. At length, being together one day, some weeks after their arrival in London, when, indeed, many steps had been already taken by him in furtherance of his project, at twilight, as they sat together near the window which looked upon one of the London squares, and they had been comparing this metropolis with many foreign cities, Falkner abruptly, fearful, if he lost this occasion of not finding another so appropriate, said, "I must bid you good-bye tonight, Elizabeth. Tomorrow early I set out for the north of England." "You mean to leave me behind?" she asked, "but you will not be away long." "I am going to visit your relations," he replied, "to disclose to them that you are under my care and to prepare them to receive you. I hope soon to return, either to conduct you to them or to bring one among them to welcome you here." Elizabeth was startled. Many years had elapsed since Falkner had alluded to her alien parentage. She went by his name, she called him father, and the appellation scarcely seemed a fiction. He had been the kindest, fondest parent to her, nor had he ever hinted that he meant to forgo the claim his adoption had given him, and to make her over to those who were worse than strangers in her eyes. If ever they had recurred to her real situation, he had not been chary of expressions of indignation against the Raby family. He had described with warm resentment the selfishness, the hardness of heart, and disdain of the well-being of those allied to them by blood, which too often subsists in aristocratic English families when the first bond has been broken by any act of disobedience. He grew angry as he spoke of the indignity with which her mother had been treated and the barbarous proposition of separating her from her only child, and he had fondly assured her that it was his dearest pride to render her independent of these unworthy and inhuman relations. Why were his intentions changed? His voice and look were ominous. Elizabeth was hurt. She did not like to object. She was silent. But Falkner deciphered her wounded feelings in her ingenuous countenance, and he too was pained. He could not bear that she should think him ungrateful, mindless of her affection, her filial attentions, and endearing virtues. He felt that he must, to a certain degree, explain his views, difficult as it was to make a segment of his feelings in any way take a definite or satisfactory shape. "Do not think hardly of me, my own dear girl," he began, "for wishing that we should separate. God knows that it is a blow that will visit me far more severely than you. You will find relations and friends who will be proud of you, whose affections you will win. Wherever you are, you will meet with love and admiration, and your sweet disposition and excellent qualities will make life happy. I depart alone. You are my only tie, my only friend. I break it and leave you. Never can I find another. Henceforth, alone, I shall wander into distant and uncivilized countries, enter on a new and perilous career, during which I may perish miserably. You cannot share these dangers with me." "But why do you seek them?" exclaimed Elizabeth, alarmed by this sudden prophecy of ill. "Do you remember the day when we first met?" replied Falkner, "when my hand was raised against my own life, because I knew myself unworthy to exist. It is the same now. It is cowardly to live, feeling that I have forfeited every right to enjoy the blessings of life. I go that I may die, not by my own hand, but where I can meet death by the hand of others." Strangely and frightfully did these words fall on the ear of his appalled listener. He went on rapidly, for having once begun, the words he uttered relieved, in some degree, the misery that burdened his soul. "This idea cannot astonish you, my love. You have seen too much of the secret of my heart. You have witnessed my fits of distress and anguish, and are not now told, for the first time, that grief and remorse weigh intolerably on me. I can endure the infliction no longer. May God forgive me in another world. The light of this I will see no more." Falkner saw the sort of astonished distress her countenance depicted, and angry with himself for being its cause, was going on in a voice changed to one less expressive of misery. But Elizabeth, seized with dismay, the unbidden tears pouring from her eyes, her child's heart bursting with a new sense of horror, cast herself at his feet, and embracing his knees as he sat, exclaimed, "My dear, dear father, my more than father and only friend, you break my heart by speaking thus. If you are miserable, the more need that your child, the creature you preserved and taught to love you, should be at your side to comfort, I had almost said to help you. You must not cast me off. Were you happy, you might desert me. But if you are miserable, I cannot leave you. You must not ask me. It kills me to think of it." The youthful, who have no experience of the changes of life, regard the present with far more awe and terror than those who have seen one turn in the hourglass suffice to change, and change again, the color of their lives. To be divided from Falkner was to have the pillars of the earth shaken under her, and she clung to him and looked up imploringly in his face, as if the next word he spoke were to decide all. He kissed her, and seating her on his knee, said, "Let us talk of this more calmly, dearest. I was wrong to agitate you, or to mix the miserable thoughts forced on me by my wretchedness with the prudent consideration of your future destiny. I feel it to be unjust to keep you from your relations. They are rich. We are ignorant of what changes and losses may have taken place among them, to soften their hearts, which after all were never shut against you. You may have become of importance in their eyes. Raby is a proud name, and we must not heedlessly forgo the advantages that may belong to your right to it." "My dear father," replied Elizabeth, "this talk is not for me. I have no wish to claim the kindness of those who treated my true parents ill. You are everything to me. I am little more than a child, and cannot find words to express all I mean, but my truest meaning is to show my gratitude to you till my dying day, to remain with you forever while you love me, and to be the most miserable creature in the world if you drive me from you. Have we not lived together since I was a little thing, no higher than your knee? And all the time you have been kinder than any father. When we have been exposed to storms, you have wrapped me round in your arms so that no drop could fall on my head. Do you remember that dreadful evening when our carriage broke down in the wide, dark steppe, and you, covering me up, carried me in your arms while the wind howled and the freezing rain drove against you? You could hardly bear up. And when we arrived at the post-house, you, strong man as you are, fainted from exhaustion, while I, sheltered in your arms, was as warm and well as if it had been a summer's day. You have earned me, you have bought me by all this kindness, and you must not cast me away." She clung round his neck, her face bathed in tears, sobbing and speaking in broken accents. As she saw him soften, she implored him yet more earnestly, till his heart was quite subdued, and clasping her to his heart, he showered kisses on her head and neck, while, to his surprise, forgotten tears sprung to his own eyes. "For worlds I would not desert you," he cried. "'Tis not casting you away that we should separate for a short time, for where I go, indeed, dearest, you cannot accompany me. I cannot go on living as I have done. For many years now my life has been spent in pleasantness and peace. I have no right to this. Hardship and toil and death I ought to repay. I abhor myself for a coward when I think of what others suffer through my deeds, while I am scathless. You can scarcely remember the hour when the touch of your little hand saved my life. My heart is not changed since then. I am unworthy to exist. Dear Elizabeth, you may one day hate me, when you know the misery I have caused to those who deserved better at my hands. The cry of my victim rings in my ears, and I am base to survive my crime. Let me, dearest, make my own the praise, that nothing graced my life more than the leaving it. To live a coward and a drone suits vilely with my former acts of violence and ill. Let me gain peace of mind by exposing my life to danger. By advocating a just cause, I may bring a blessing down upon my endeavors. I shall go to Greece. Theirs is a good cause, that of liberty and Christianity against tyranny and an evil faith. Let me die for it, and when it is known, as it will one day be, that the innocent perish through me, it will be added that I died in the defense of the suffering and the brave. But you cannot go with me to Greece, dearest. You must await my return in this country. You go to die, she exclaimed, and I am to be far away. No, dear father, I am a little girl, but no harm can happen to me. The Ionian Isles are under the English government. There at least I may go. Athens, too, I dare say, is safe. Dear Athens, we spent a happy winter there before the revolution began. You forget what a traveler I am, how accustomed to find my home among strangers in foreign and savage lands. No, dear father, you will not leave me behind. I am not unreasonable. I do not ask to follow you to the camp, but you must let me be near in the same country as yourself. You force me to yield against my better reason, said Falkner. This is not right. I feel that it is not so. One of your sex, and so young, ought not to be exposed to all I am about to encounter, and if I should die and leave you there desolate. There are good Christians everywhere to protect the orphan, persisted Elizabeth. As if you could die when I am with you, and if you died while I was far, what would become of me? Am I to be left, like a poor sailor's wife, to get a shocking black-sealed letter to tell me that, while I was enjoying myself and hoping that you had long been, it is wicked to speak of these things, but I shall go with my own dear, dear father, and he shall not die. Falkner yielded to her tears, her caresses, and persuasions. He was not convinced, but he could not withstand the excess of grief she displayed at the thought of parting. It was agreed that she should accompany him to the Ionian Isles and take up her residence there while he joined the patriot band in Greece. This point being decided upon, he was anxious that their departure should not be delayed a single hour, for most earnest was he to go, to throw off the sense of the present, to forget his pangs in anticipated danger. Falkner played no false part with himself. He longed to die, nor did the tenderness and fidelity of Elizabeth disarm his purpose. He was convinced that she must be happier and more prosperous when he was removed. His tortured mind found relief when he thought of sacrificing his life and quitting it honorably on the field of battle. It was only by the prospect of such a fate that he shut his eyes to sterner duties. In his secret heart, he knew that the course demanded of him by honor and conscience was to stand forth, declare his crime, and reveal the mysterious tragedy of which he was the occasion to the world. But he dared not accuse himself and live. It was this that urged him to the thoughts of death. When I am no more, he told himself, let all be declared, let my name be loaded with curses, but let it be added that I died to expiate my guilt. I cannot be called upon to live with a brand upon my name. Soon it will be all over, and then let them heap obloquy pyramid high upon my grave. Poor Elizabeth will become a raby, and once cold beneath the sod, no more misery will spring from acts of mine. Actuated by these thoughts, Falkner drew up two narratives, both short. The tenor of one need not be mentioned in this place. The other stated how he had found Elizabeth and adopted her. He sealed up with this the few documents that proved her birth. He also made his will, dividing his property between his heir-at-law and adopted child, and smiled proudly to think that, dowered thus by him, she would be gladly received into her father's family. Every other arrangement for their voyage was quickly made, and it remained only to determine whether Miss Jervis should accompany them. Elizabeth's mind was divided. She was averse to parting with an unoffending and kind companion, and to forego her instructions, though in truth she had got beyond them. But she feared that the governess might hereafter shackle her conduct. Every word Falkner had let fall concerning his desire to die, she remembered and pondered upon. To watch over and to serve him was her aim in going with him. Child as she was, 1,000 combinations of danger presented themselves to her imagination, when her resolution and fearlessness might bring safety. The narrow views and timid disposition of Miss Jervis might impede her grievously. The governess herself was perplexed. She was startled when she heard of the new scheme. She was pleased to find herself once again in England, and repugnant to the idea of leaving so soon again for so distant a region, where 1,000 perils of war and pestilence would beset every step. She was sorry to part with Elizabeth, but some day that time must come, and others, dearer from ties of relationship, lived in England from whom she had been too long divided. Weighing these things, she showed a degree of hesitation that caused Falkner to decide as his heart inclined, and to determine that she should not accompany him. She went with them as far as Plymouth, where they embarked. Elizabeth, so long a wanderer, felt no regret in leaving England. She was to remain with one who was far more than country, who was indeed her all. Falkner felt a load taken from his heart when his feet touched the deck of the vessel that was to bear them away. Half his duty was accomplished, the course begun which would lead to the catastrophe he coveted. The sun shone brightly on the ocean, the breeze was fresh and favorable. Miss Jervis saw them push from shore with smiles and happy looks. She saw them on the deck of the vessel, which, with sails unfurled, had already begun its course over the sea. Elizabeth waved her handkerchief. All grew confused. The vessel itself was sinking beneath the horizon, and long before night no portion of her canvas could be perceived. "I wonder," thought Miss Jervis, "whether I shall ever see them again." Chapter 9. 3 years from this time, Elizabeth found herself in the position she had vaguely anticipated at the outset, but which every day spent in Greece showed her as probable, if not inevitable. These 3 years brought Falkner to the verge of the death he had gone out to seek. He lay wounded, a prey of the Greek fever, to all appearance about to die, while she watched over him, striving not only to avert the fatal consequences of disease, but also to combat the desire to die which destroyed him. In describing Elizabeth's conduct during these 3 years, it may be thought that the type is presented of ideal and almost unnatural perfection. She was, it is true, a remarkable creature, and unless she had possessed rare and exalted qualities, her history had not afforded a topic for these pages. She was intelligent, warm-hearted, courageous, and sincere. Her lively sense of duty was perhaps her chief peculiarity. It was that which strung to such sweet harmony the other portions of her character. This had been fostered by the circumstances of her life. Her earliest recollection was of her dying parents, their mutual consolations, the bereaved widow's lament, and her talk of another and a better world, where all would meet again who fulfilled their part virtuously in this world. She had been taught to remember her parents as inheriting the immortal life promised to the just, and to aspire to the same. She had learned from her mother's example that there is nothing so beautiful and praiseworthy as the sacrifice of life to the good and happiness of one beloved. She never forgot her debt to Falkner. She felt herself bound to him by stronger than filial ties. A father performs an imperious duty in cherishing his child, but all had been spontaneous benevolence in Falkner. His very faults and passions made his sacrifice the greater, and his generosity the more conspicuous. Elizabeth believed that she could never adequately repay the vast obligation which she was under to him. Miss Jervis also had conduced to perfectionize her mind by adding to its harmony and justness. Miss Jervis, it is true, might be compared to the rough-handed gardener, whose labors are without elegance, and yet to whose waterings and vigilance the fragrant carnation owes its peculiar tint, and the wax-like camellia its especial variety. It was through her that she had methodized her mind, through her that she had learned to concentrate and prolong her attention, and to devote it to study. She had taught her order and industry, and without knowing it, she had done more. She had inspired ardor for knowledge, delight in its acquisition, and a glad sense of self-approbation when difficulties were conquered by perseverance, and when, by dint of resolution, ignorance was exchanged for a clear perception of any portion of learning. It has been said that every clever person is, to a certain degree, mad, by which it is to be understood that every person whose mind soars above the vulgar has some exalted and disinterested object in view to which they are ready to sacrifice the common blessings of life. Thus, from the moment that Elizabeth had brought Falkner to consent to her accompanying him to Greece, she had devoted herself to the task, first, of saving his life, if it should be in danger, and secondly, of reconciling him in the end to prolonged existence. There were many difficulties which presented themselves, since she was unaware of the circumstances that drove him to seek death as a remedy and an atonement, nor had she any desire to pry into her benefactor's secrets. In her own heart, she suspected an overstrained delicacy, generosity of feeling, which exaggerated error and gave the sting to remorse. But whatever was the occasion of his sufferings, she dedicated herself to their relief, and resolved to educate herself so as to fulfill the task of reconciling him to life to the best of her ability. Left at Zante, while he proceeded to join the patriot bands of Greece, she boarded in the house of a respectable family, but lived in the most retired manner possible. Her chief time was spent in study. She read to store her mind, to confirm its fortitude, to elevate its tone. She read, also, to acquire such precepts of philosophy and religion as might best apply to her peculiar task, and to learn those secrets of life and death which Falkner's desire to die had brought so home to her juvenile imagination. If a time is to be named when the human heart is nearest moral perfection, most alive, and yet most innocent, aspiring to good, without a knowledge of evil, the period at which Elizabeth had arrived, from 13 to 16, is it. Vague forebodings are awakened, a sense of the opening drama of life, unaccompanied with any longing to enter on it. That feeling is reserved for the years that follow. But at 14 and 15, we only feel that we are emerging from childhood, and we rejoice, having yet a sense that as yet it is not fitting that we should make one of the real actors on the world's stage. A dreamy, delicious period when all is unknown, and yet we feel that all is soon to be unveiled. The first pang has not been felt, for we consider childhood's woes real and frightful as those sometimes are as puerile and no longer belonging to us. We look upon the menaced evils of life as a fiction. How can care touch the soul which places its desires beyond low-minded thought? Ingratitude, deceit, treason, these have not yet engendered distrust of others, nor have our own weaknesses and errors planted the thorn of self-disapprobation and regret. Solitude is no evil, for the thoughts are rife with busy visions, and the shadows that flit around and people our reveries have almost the substance and vitality of the actual world. Elizabeth was no dreamer. Though brought up abstracted from common worldly pursuits, there was something singularly practical about her. She aimed at being useful in all her reveries. This desire was rendered still more fervent by her affection for Falkner, by her fears on his account, by her ardent wish to make life dear to him. All her employments, all her pleasures, referred themselves, as it were, to this primary motive, and were entirely ruled by it. She portioned out the hours of each day, and adhered steadily to her self-imposed rules. To the early morning's ride succeeded her various studies, of which music, for which she developed a true ear and delicate taste, formed one occupation relieved the other. From her dear books she had recourse to her needle, and bending over her embroidery frame, she meditated on what she read. Or, occupied by many conjectures and many airy dreams concerning Falkner, she became absorbed in reverie. Sometimes, from the immediate object of these, her memory reverted to the melancholy boy she had seen at Baden. His wild eyes, his haughty glance, his lively solicitude about the animal he had hurt, and uncomplaining fortitude with which he had endured bodily pain were often present to her. She wished that they had not quitted Baden so suddenly. If they had remained but a few days longer, he might have learned to love them. And even now he might be with Falkner, sharing his dangers, it is true, but also each guarding the other from that rash contempt of life in which they both indulged. Her whole mind being filled by duties and affection, each day seemed short, yet each was varied. At dawn she rose lightly from her bed and looked out over the blue sea and rocky shore. She prayed, as she gazed, for the safety of her benefactor, and her thoughts, soaring to her mother in heaven, asked her blessing to descend upon her child. Morning was not so fresh as her, as she met its first sweet breath, and cantering along the beach, she thought of Falkner, his absence, his toils and dangers, with resignation, mingled with a hope that warmed into an ardent desire to see him again. Surely there is no object so sweet as the young in solitude. In after years, when death has bereaved us of the dearest, when cares and regrets and fears and passions, evil either in their nature or their results, have stained our lives with black, solitude is too sadly peopled to be pleasing, and when we see one of mature years alone, we believe that sadness must be the companion. But the solitary thoughts of the young are glorious dreams. Their state, like to a lark at break of day arising, from sullen earth sings hymns at heaven's gate. To behold this young and lovely girl wandering by the lonely shore, her thoughts her only companions, love for her benefactor her only passion, no touch of earth and its sordid woes about her. It was as if a new Eve, watched over by angels, had been placed in the desecrated land, and the very ground she trod grew into paradise. Sometimes the day was sadly checkered by bad news brought from the continent of Greece. Sometimes it was rendered joyous by the arrival of a letter from her adored father. Sometimes he was with her, and he, animated by the sense of danger and the knowledge of his usefulness to the cause he espoused, was eloquent in his narrations, overflowing in his affection to her, and almost happy in the belief that he was atoning for the past. The idea that he should fall in the fields of Greece and wash out with his heart's blood the dark blot on his name gave an elevation to his thoughts, a strained and eager courage and fortitude that accorded with his fiery character. He was born to be a soldier, not the military man of modern days, but the hero who exposed his life without fear and found joy in battle and hard-earned victory when these were sought and won for a good cause from the cruel oppressor. Chapter 10. During Falkner's visits to Zante, Elizabeth had been led to remark the faithful attentions of his chief follower, an Albanian Greek. This man had complained to his young mistress of the recklessness with which Falkner exposed himself, of the incredible fatigue he underwent, and his belief that he must ere long fall a victim to his disdain of safety and repose, which, while it augmented the admiration his courage excited, was yet not called for by the circumstances of the times. He would have been termed rash and foolhardy, but that he maintained a dignified composure throughout, joined to military skill and fertility of resource, and while contempt of life led him invariably to select the post of danger for himself, he was sedulous to preserve the lives of those under his command. His early life had familiarized him with the practices of war. He was a valuable officer, kind to his men, and careful to supply their wants, while he contended for no vain distinctions, and was ready, on all occasions, to undertake such duties as others shrunk from as leading to certain death. Elizabeth listened to Vasily's account of his hairbreadth escapes, his toils and desperate valor, with tearful eyes and an aching heart. Oh, that I could attach him to life, she thought. She never complained to him, nor persuaded him to alter his desperate purpose, but redoubled her affectionate attentions. When he left her after a hurried visit, she did not beseech him to preserve himself, but her tearful eyes, the agony with which she returned his parting embrace, her despondent attitude as his bark left the shore, and when he returned, her eager joy, her eye lighted up. With thankful love, all bespoke emotions that needed no other interpreter, and which often made him half shrink from acting up to the belief he had arrived at, that he ought to die, and that he could only escape worse and ignominious evils by a present and honorable death. As time passed on, as by the arrival of the forces from Egypt the warfare grew more keen and perilous, as Vasily renewed the sad tale of his perils at each visit, with some added story of lately and narrowly escaped peril, fear began to make too large and engrossing a portion of her daily thoughts. She ceased to take in the ideas as she read, her needle dropped from her hand, and as she played, the music brought streams of tears from her eyes, to think of the scene of desolation and suffering in which she felt that she should soon be called upon to take a part. There was no help or hope, and she must early learn the woman's first and hardest lesson, to bear in silence the advance of an evil which might be avoided, but for the unconquerable will of another. Almost she could have called her father cruel, had not the remembrance of the misery that drove him to desperation inspired pity instead of selfish resentment. He had passed a few days with her, and the intercourse they held had been more intimate and more affectionate than ever. As she grew older, her mind, enriched by cultivation and developed by the ardor of her attachment, grew more on an equality with his experienced one than could have been the case in mere childhood. They did not take the usual position of father and child, the instructor and instructed, the commander and the obedient. They talked with open heart and tongue, affectionate and true, a pair of friends, and the inequality which made her depend on him and caused him to regard her as the creature who was to prolong his existence, as it were, beyond the grave, into which he believed himself to be descending, gave a touch of something melancholy to their sympathy, without which, in this shadowy world, nothing seems beautiful and enduring. He left her and his little bark, under press of sail, sped merrily through the waves. She stood to watch, her heart warmed by the recollection of his fervent affection, his attentive kindness. He had ever been brave and generous, but now he had become so sympathizing and gentle that she hoped that the time was not far off when moral courage would spring from that personal hardihood which is at once so glorious and so fearful. God shield you, my father, she thought. God preserve you, my more than father, for happier thoughts and better days, for the full enjoyment of and control over those splendid qualities with which nature has gifted you. Such was the tenor of her thoughts. Enthusiasm mingled with fond solicitude, and thus she continued her anxious watchings. By every opportunity she received brief letters, breathing affection, yet containing no word of self. Sometimes a phrase occurred directing her what to do if anything fatal occurred to him, which startled and pained her, but there was nothing else that spoke of death, nor any allusion to his distaste for life. Autumn was far advanced. The sounds of war were somewhat lulled, and except in small skirmishing parties that met and fought under cover of the ravines and woods, all was quiet. Elizabeth felt less fearful than usual. She wrote to ask when Falkner would again visit her, and he, in reply, promised so to do immediately after a meditated attack on a small fortress, the carrying of which was of the first import to the safe quartering of his little troop during the winter. She read this with delight. She solaced herself with the prospect of a speedier and longer visit than usual. With childish thoughtlessness, she forgot that the attack on the town was a work of war, and might bring with it the fatal results of mortal struggle. A few days after, a small, ill-looking letter was put into her hands. It was written in Romaic, and the meaning of its illegible ciphers could only be guessed at by a Greek. It was from Vasily, to tell her, in a few words, that Falkner was lying in a small village, not far from the sea-coast, opposite Zante. It mentioned that he had been long suffering from a Greek fever, and having been badly wounded in the late attack, the combined effects of wound and malady left little hopes of recovery, while the fatal moment was hastened by the absence of all medical assistance, the miserable state of the village where he was lying, and the bad air of the country around. Elizabeth read as if in a dream. The moment then had come, the fatal moment which she had often contemplated with terror and prayed heaven to avert. She grew pale and trembling, but again, in a moment, she recalled her presence of mind, and summoned all the resolution she had endeavored to store up to assist her at this extremity. She went herself to the chief English authority in the island and obtained an order for a vessel to bring him off. Instantly she embarked. She neither wept nor spoke, but sitting on the deck, tearless and pale, she prayed for speed, and that she might not find him dead. A few hours brought her to the desired port. Here 1,000 difficulties awaited her, but she was not to be intimidated by all the threatened dangers, and only besought the people about her to admit of no excuses for delay. She was accompanied by an English surgeon and a few attendants. She longed to outspeed them all, and yet she commanded herself to direct everything that was done, nor did her heart quail when a few shot, and the cry of the men about her, spoke of the neighborhood of the enemy. It proved a false alarm. The shots came from a straggling party of Greeks, salutations were exchanged, and still she pushed on. Her only thought was, let me but find him alive, and then surely he will live. As she passed along, the sallow countenances and wasted figures of the peasants spoke of the frightful ravages of the epidemic by which Falkner was attacked, and the squalidness of the cabins and the filth of the villages were sights to make her heart ache. At length, they drew near one which the guide told her was that named by Vasily. On inquiring, they were directed down a sort of lane to a wretched, dilapidated dwelling, in the courtyard of which were a party of armed Greeks, gathered together in a sort of ominous silence. This was the abode of Falkner. She alighted, and in a few minutes Vasily presented himself, his face painted with every mark of apprehension and sorrow. He led her on. The house was desolate beyond expression. There was no furniture, no glass in the windows, no token of human habitation beyond the weather-stained walls. She entered the room where her father lay. Some mattresses placed on the divan were all his bed, and there was nothing else in the room except a brazier to heat his food. Elizabeth drew near and gazed in awe and grief. Already he was so changed that she could scarcely know him, his eyes sunk, his cheeks fallen, his brow streaked with pallid hues. A ghastly shadow lay upon his face, the apparent forerunner of death. He had scarcely strength sufficient to raise his hand, and his voice was hollow. Yet he smiled when he saw her, and that smile, the last refuge of the soul that informs our clay and even sometimes survives it, was all his own. It struck her to the heart, and her eyes were dimmed with tears while Vasily cast a wistful glance on her, as much as to say, "I have lost hope." "Thank you for coming, yet you ought not to be here," hoarsely murmured the sick man. Elizabeth kissed his hand and brow in answer, and despite of all her endeavors, the tears fell from her eyes on his sunken cheek. Again he smiled. "It is not so bad," he said. "Do not weep, I am willing to die. I do not suffer very much, though I am weary of life." The surgeon was now admitted. He examined the wound, which was of a musket bullet in his side. He dressed it and administered some potion from which the patient received instant relief, and then joined the anxious girl who had retired to another room. "He is in a very dangerous state," the surgeon remarked, in reply to her anxious looks. "Nothing certain can be pronounced yet, but our first care must be to remove him from this pestiferous place. The fever and wound combined must destroy him. Change of air may produce an amelioration in the former." With all the energy which was her prominent characteristic, Elizabeth caused a litter to be prepared, horses hired, and everything arranged so that their journey might be commenced at daybreak. Everyone went early to rest, to enjoy some repose before the morrow's journey, except Elizabeth. She spent the livelong night watching beside Falkner, marking each change, tortured by the groans that escaped him in his sleep, or the suppressed complaints that fell from his lips, by the restlessness and fever that rendered each moment full of fate. The glimmering and dreary light of the lamp increased even the squalid and bare appearance of the wretched chamber in which he lay. Elizabeth gazed for a moment from the casement to see how moved the stars, and there, without, nature asserted herself, and it was the lovely land of Greece that met her eyes. The southern night reigned in all its beauty. The stars hung refulgent lamps in the transparent ether. The fireflies darted and wheeled among the olive groves, or rested in the myrtle hedges, flashing intermittingly, and filling for an instant a small space around them with fairy brightness. Each form of tree, of rocky fragment, and broken upland, lay in calm and beautiful repose. She turned to the low couch on which lay all her hope, her idolized father. The streaked brow, the nerveless hand, half-open eye, and hard breathing betokened a frightful stage of weakness and suffering. The scene brought unsought into her mind the lines of the English poet, which so touchingly describes the desolation of Greece, blending the idea of mortal suffering with the long-drawn calamities of that oppressed country. The words, the lines, crowded on her memory, and a chord was struck in her heart as she ejaculated, "No, no, not so, not the first day of death, not now or ever." As she spoke, she dissolved in tears, and weeping long and bitterly, she became afterward calmer. The rest of her watch passed more peacefully. Even the patient suffered less as night verged into morning. At an early hour all was ready. Falkner was placed in the litter, and the little party, gladly leaving the precincts of the miserable village, proceeded slowly towards the seashore. Every step was replete with pain and danger. Elizabeth was again all herself. Self-possessed and vigilant, she seemed at once to attain years of experience. No one could remember that it was a girl of 16 who directed them. Hovering round the litter of the wounded man and pointing out how best to carry him so that he might suffer least, as the inequalities of the ground, the heights to climb, and the ravines to cross, made it a task of difficulty. Now and then the report of a musket was heard. Sometimes a Greek cap, not unoften mistaken for a turban, peered above the precipice that overlooked the road. Frequent alarms were given, but she was frightened by none. Her large eyes dilated and darkened as she looked towards the danger pointed out, and she drew nearer the litter, as a lonely mother might to the cradle of her child, when in the stillness of night some ravenous beast intruded on a savage solitude. But she never spoke, except to point out the mistakes she was the first to perceive, or to order the men to proceed lightly, but without fear, nor to allow their progress to be checked by vain alarms.